Picture this Paris, 1789. The streets are alive with the roar of revolution, and in the chaos, a name echoes through the crowd like a battle cry: Prometheus. The ancient titan who defied the gods to bring fire to humanity becomes the unlikely symbol of a people rising against their king. But why? Why would revolutionaries, armed with the urgency of change, reach back thousands of years to a myth? The answer lies in the hidden power of stories. Across centuries, from the Roman Republic to the struggles of modern movements, myths have been more than just tales of gods and monsters. They've been secret maps, coded guides for rebellion, wrapped in the guise of legend. Think about it, myths are timeless, universal. They're stories everyone knows, but few truly question. And that's what makes them the perfect disguise. When you can't speak openly against tyranny, you cloak your defiance in the language of Hercules, slaying a Hydra, or Theseus, navigating the labyrinth. These aren't just adventures, they're blueprints for resistance. The French Revolution didn't just invoke Prometheus as a poetic flourish. They saw themselves in his defiance, his sacrifice. It was a way to say, we are stealing fire from the oppressors without ever uttering those words aloud. Myths become a shared language, a way to unite people under a banner older than any king or empire. So what's really going on here? Why do revolutionaries time and again turn to myths instead of manifestos? The truth is, myths are survival tools. They outlive empires. They cross borders. A myth can be whispered in a prison cell, etched into a pamphlet, or shouted in a square, and everyone understands not just the surface story, but the deeper call to action. In this video, we're unraveling that thread. We'll trace how ancient stories became the hidden scaffolding of revolutions, how a tale about a god's punishment could inspire a crowd to tear down a throne. This isn't just about history, it's about the enduring power of storytelling to shape the world. And by the end, you'll never look at myths the same way again. Take the story of Theseus and the Minotaur on the surface. It's a hero's journey, a young man slaying a beast. But look closer, and you'll find something far more dangerous hiding in the labyrinth. The Minotaur isn't just a monster, it's a symbol of tyranny, a king's violent appetite demanding sacrifice. The Cretan labyrinth, that's the maze of oppression, the system designed to keep people lost and afraid. And Theseus, he's the revolutionary who dares to unravel it. This wasn't just entertainment, it was allegory, a way to critique power without saying a ruler's name outright. Ancient storytellers mastered this art of hidden rebellion. They knew myths could smuggle dangerous ideas past the censors, wrapping dissent in the familiar cloak of legend. Plato saw the risk. In the Republic, he warned that myths could be tools of control, but also weapons against it. A story about gods behaving badly could make people question why kings acted the same way. A hero defying fate could inspire others to defy their rulers. Myths were never neutral. They were Trojan horses carrying the seeds of rebellion inside them. Centuries later, revolutionaries would crack open these ancient codes. When the American colonists compared King George to the Minotaur, or French pamphlets painted Louis XVI as a monstrous Cronus devouring his children, they weren't just borrowing imagery. They were tapping into a tradition of resistance as old as storytelling itself. The myth became a mirror, reflecting back the abuses of power in a language everyone understood. And that's the genius of allegory. It lets you say the unsayable, to whisper treason in plain sight. Because once people start seeing their rulers as minotaurs, the labyrinth won't hold them for long. The story of Lucretia isn't just a tragedy, it's a revolution in disguise. In ancient Rome, her name became a rallying cry, the spark that lit the fire to burn down a kingdom. According to the historian Livy, Lucretia was a noblewoman whose brutal violation by the king's son became the ultimate symbol of tyranny's corruption. But here's the twist: her story wasn't just about her suffering. It was about how that suffering was framed. When Brutus, the revolutionary, held up her body before the people, he wasn't mourning, he was strategizing. Lucretia's death became proof that monarchy itself was a moral poison, that no one was safe under its rule. And just like that, a personal tragedy was transformed into a political weapon. Livy's account is careful, almost too careful. He paints Lucretia as the perfect victim, chaste, virtuous, and utterly blameless. But historians have long noticed the gaps in his telling. Why emphasize her purity so heavily? Because revolutions need clean narratives. Brutus and his allies couldn't afford ambiguity. To justify overthrowing a king, they needed a story so stark, so morally undeniable, that resistance felt like duty. Lucretia's myth was tailored, polished into a tool. Her suicide wasn't just an act of despair, it was staged as the ultimate rebuke to power. This is what tyranny does, the revolutionaries whispered. And this is why it must fall. The brilliance of this tactic is how timeless it is. Fast forward to modern movements, and you'll see the same pattern. Stories of sacrifice, carefully shaped to expose injustice. Think of how figures like Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. turned personal suffering into a mirror for societal failure. Their struggles weren't just theirs, they were framed as symptoms of a broken system. That's the power of mythic storytelling. It turns individual pain into collective fuel. Lucretia's story set the blueprint. By the time medieval rebels began weaving pagan myths into Christian uprisings, the playbook was already written. A martyr, a monster, a moral reckoning. The ingredients were always the same. Because when you're fighting giants, sometimes you need a slingshot made of stories. And that's the real lesson here. Myths don't just survive history, they shape it. The Roman Republic didn't rise because of armies or treaties alone. It rose because revolutionaries mastered the art of narrative alchemy, turning grief into a call to arms. Every rebellion since has followed their lead, reaching for the oldest stories to justify the newest fights. Because when the stakes are high, the best weapon isn't always a sword. Sometimes it's a story sharp enough to cut through centuries. In the smoky taverns of 14th century France, where peasants whispered plans for rebellion, you wouldn't expect King Arthur's knights to be part of the conversation. But here's the twist. The Jackery uprising didn't just demand bread or justice, it draped its rage in the language of legend. These weren't just farmers with pitchforks. They cast themselves as modern-day Percivals on a holy quest to restore a lost golden age. The church had saints and martyrs to justify the social order, but the rebels, they reached further back to myths the clergy couldn't fully erase. Arthur's promise of return, of a king who'd rise when his people needed him most, became coded hope for a world turned upside down. This wasn't accidental. Medieval rebellions were masterclasses in mythic recycling. When the church controlled the narrative, painting dissent as heresy, rebels smuggled their defiance into stories that sounded harmless, even pious. Take Robin Hood, that cheerful outlaw stealing from the rich. On the surface, a merry tale. Underneath, a blueprint for wealth redistribution. Historian Eric Hobsbawm called figures like Robin social bandits, outlaws the people reframed as heroes. But dig deeper, and you'll find something older than medieval ballads. Robin's Greenwood Sanctuary echoes pagan myths of the wild as a place of justice, where the rules of castles and cathedrals didn't apply. The church preached patience and heaven's reward, but these stories whispered a different truth, that sometimes the sacred duty was to fight. The real genius was in the duality. A peasant could sing a Robin Hood ballad in front of a priest without fear because the surface story was harmless, but everyone knew the subtext, the way Robin's arrows found their marks just like the rebel scythes might. This was myth as camouflage, a way to keep ancient ideas of resistance alive under the watchful eyes of power. And it wasn't just Europe. From Japanese peasant uprisings invoking the Ikki rebellions to Slavic communities preserving pre-Christian tales of forest spirits who punished greedy lords, the pattern was universal. When words of revolt are forbidden, stories become your weapons. Then came the Renaissance and the game changed. Humanists like Erasmus didn't just read Ovid or Virgil for pretty phrases, they mined them for ammunition. Suddenly, the myths the church had sidelined as pagan relics were back in vogue, but with a razor's edge. When Machiavelli wrote The Prince, he didn't cite scripture. He invoked Theseus, the mythic founder of states. Here's the irony. The very stories medieval rebels used to hide their dissent became, in the hands of scholars, direct challenges to authority. The church had spent centuries erasing pagan voices, only for humanists to resurrect them as tools of critique. A statue of Apollo wasn't just art, it was a quiet manifesto, a reminder that there were older, perhaps wiser, ways to govern. What ties these moments together? The understanding that myths are never just stories, they're shape-shifters adapting to the needs of the oppressed. Whether whispered in a serf's hut or debated in a Florentine salon, they carried the same electric charge, the idea that the world could be different. And that's why authorities feared them. A crown could crush a rebellion, but how do you kill a story that keeps finding new mouths to tell it? By the time Giordano Bruno stood trial in Rome in the year 1600, the church had a problem. Myths were escaping their cages. Bruno, a renegade philosopher, didn't just study ancient texts, he weaponized them. In his hands, Prometheus wasn't just a cautionary tale, he was a martyr for free thought. And Hermes Trismegistus, the mythical sage, became a beacon for forbidden knowledge. Bruno's heresy wasn't just his science, it was his insistence that these old stories held truths more vital than scripture. The irony, the very myths the Renaissance had revived to celebrate human potential, were now turning against the institutions that had nurtured them. This was the double edge of the Neoplatonic revival. Philosophers like Marsilio Ficino had dusted off Plato's dialogues, framing the cosmos as a place where divine wisdom could be unlocked, but that wisdom was slippery. If the universe was a puzzle to be solved, as Ficino suggested, then who got to hold the key? Botticelli's Primavera might look like a pretty allegory of spring, but zoom in. Venus, flanked by the three Graces, isn't just a goddess, she's a stand-in for Florence herself, and the swirling figures around her. They're not just nymphs, they're nods to the Neoplatonic ideal that beauty and truth could exist outside church doctrine. The Medici, who commissioned the painting, thought they were celebrating their power. What they didn't see was how easily those symbols could be turned against them. Then came the printing press, and the game changed entirely. Pamphlets laden with mythic imagery, Hercules overthrowing tyrants, Orpheus charming the underworld spread like wildfire. Suddenly, a weaver in Antwerp or a bookseller in Venice could get their hands on stories that questioned authority, wrapped in the respectable cloak of classical learning. The church had burned Bruno for his heresies, but they couldn't burn every copy of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Myths, once confined to parchment in monastery libraries, were now mass-produced grenades rolling into the hands of anyone who dared to think differently. And that's how the Enlightenment inherited a rebel's toolbox. When Voltaire wrote of crushing tyrannies, sacred monsters, he wasn't just being poetic, he was tapping into a lineage that stretched back to Bruno's Prometheus. The philosophers didn't need to invent new metaphors, They had centuries of coded defiance ready to use. The difference, by the 18th century, the labyrinth wasn't just a myth, it was the system itself, and the Minotaur wore a crown. Myths had done their job too well. They'd taught people to see the monsters, and now nothing could stop them from grabbing the sword. Voltaire's quill might as well have been a scalpel, dissecting the divine right of kings with myths as his anesthetic. When he wrote of priests and monarchs as sacred monsters, he wasn't just mocking power, he was flipping the script on the very stories that had upheld it for centuries. Take Apollo, once the radiant god of prophecy and light. In Voltaire's hands, he became the patron of reason, his lyre traded for a microscope. The message was sly but lethal. If even the gods could be reinvented, why not the social order? Diderot went further, stuffing the encyclopedia with mythic allegories that turned Olympus into a satirical court. Here's the joke they were all in on. By dressing radical ideas in the togas of antiquity, they made heresy look like homework. But the French Revolution took this game to its logical extreme. Even as they razed churches and beheaded kings, the revolutionaries couldn't quit mythic theater. The official cult of reason might have denounced superstition, yet its festivals were drenched in pagan symbolism. Not a dame was rebranded as a temple of reason, but the centerpiece. A statue of liberty posed like Athena, flanked by torches straight from Eleusinian mysteries. And then there was Hercules, muscled, relentless, crushing hydras of tyranny in every pamphlet. The irony was delicious. A movement that claimed to worship logic kept reaching for the oldest magic of all storytelling. Marat's journals reveal the tactic's brilliance. When he described Louis XVI as a modern Minos, sacrificing children to his greed, he wasn't just insulting the king. He was activating a shared vocabulary of outrage. Peasants who'd never read Plutarch knew the Minotaur's hunger. The myth did the heavy lifting, turning abstract injustice into something visceral, something unforgivable. That's the alchemy revolutionaries mastered, transforming ancient tales into emotional napalm. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, colonial rebels were playing the same game with different legends. In Haiti, Toussaint Louverture invoked the serpent god Damballa to unite enslaved Africans and Creoles against France. In the Andes, Tupac Amaru Roman II wrapped his revolt in Incan sun symbolism, framing Spanish rule as an unnatural darkness. These weren't just aesthetic choices, they were strategic strikes at the psyche of power. European colonizers had weaponized their own myths to justify conquest. Now the oppressed were firing those symbols back like bullets. The pattern holds a mirror to a universal truth. No revolution succeeds on facts alone. You need a story that makes the fight feel inevitable, even sacred. And nothing does that better than a myth, because once people see their struggle as the latest chapter in an eternal battle between fire and tyranny, retreat isn't an option. The Enlightenment's thinkers knew this, the revolutionaries knew it, and that's why, for all their talk of reason, they never stopped speaking in the language of gods. When the drums of Bois Cayman echoed through the Haitian night in 1791, they weren't just calling rebels to arms, they were summoning gods. The Haitian Revolution, often reduced to a footnote in histories of the Atlantic world, was something far more radical, a war where myth became strategy. Enslaved Africans, ripped from dozens of ethnic groups and languages, found unity not in French or Spanish, but in the shared cosmology of Vodou. Damballa, the serpent spirit of creation, coiled around their resistance like a living banner. Ogaun, the warrior Loa, lent his fiery strength to their machetes. This wasn't mere symbolism, it was tactical genius. French planters had tried to fracture solidarity by mixing ethnicities, but Vodou wove them into something unbreakable. The ceremony at Boys Cayman didn't just launch a revolt, it rewrote the rules of rebellion, proving that the stories a people carry can be stronger than the chains that bind them. Half a world away, the Maori of Aotearoa were fighting a different empire with the same ancient tools. When British settlers claimed their lands in the 19th century, Maori leaders didn't just cite treaties, they invoked the myth of Ranginui and Papatuanuku, the Sky Father and Earth Mother whose separation created the world. Colonial fences weren't just theft, they were sacrilege, a violation of the primal bond between land and people. Scholar Anne Salmond notes how Maori orators used these creation narratives to frame resistance as a sacred duty, turning courtrooms and protests into spaces where mythic time collided with colonial law. A deed of sale might be written in English ink, but how could it outweigh the ink of the stars, which had names in Te Reo Maori long before Cook's ships appeared? What linked these struggles across oceans was the way oral traditions smuggled resistance under oppression's nose. In Haiti, Vodou's hybrid pantheon, mixing West African spirits with Catholic saints, let enslaved people worship openly while hiding subversion in plain sight. A prayer to St. James might really be a call to Ogaun's wrath. In New Zealand, the British banned tattooing and suppressed the Maori language, but they couldn't erase the stories carved into the land itself. Every mountain, every river held a narrative of belonging that surveys and titles couldn't overwrite. Mitchell Rolfe Truelot's concept of silencing the past hits hard here. Colonizers didn't just rewrite history, they tried to unmake the myths that made resistance thinkable. Yet in both cases, the stories survived not in libraries, but in the spaces between words, in the rhythms of dance, in the stubborn retelling of how the world should be. By the time nationalist movements erupted across Europe in the 1800s, the blueprint was clear. Finnish activists dug up the Kalevala, Estonia's bards revived the Kelvipoge, and suddenly, these weren't just folktales, they were proof that a people existed before empires and would outlast them. The irony, many of these ancient epics were compiled by scholars in the 19th century, stitched together from fragments preserved in kitchens and fishing huts. It didn't matter. What mattered was the claim that a myth, however reconstructed, could be a knife to cut through colonial lies. When Haitian rebels shouted for liberty or death, when Maori elders recited the names of stolen rivers, they weren't just fighting for land or freedom. They were fighting for the right to tell their own stories and in that telling to remake the world. The stage lights dim at Bayreuth in 1876 as the first chords of Das Rheingold shudder through the opera house, but this isn't just music. Wagner's Ring Cycle is a mythic detonator carefully wired to blast open a new German identity. The composer didn't just adapt Norse sagas, he stripped them of their messy Scandinavian roots, reforging them into a distinctly Germanic prophecy. Siegfried's sword wasn't merely a weapon, it was a metaphor for national unity, waiting to be pulled from the crumbling rock of petty principalities. Wagner's genius, or perhaps his danger, was understanding that myths don't just reflect identity, they manufacture it. By splicing together fragments of Eddas and Nibelungenlied, he created an origin story for a people who didn't yet exist as a nation. The irony, the very tales he claimed as pure Germanic heritage were once shared cultural currency across medieval Europe, traded like coins along Viking routes. Meanwhile, in Finland, a province shackled to Russia and stripped of its autonomy, a doctor named Elias Lönnrot was stitching together something even more audacious. Trekking through remote villages, he collected runic songs scattered like beads from a broken necklace, weaving them into the Kalevala. On the surface, an epic poem, underneath, a cultural balm. Lönnrot's editing was masterful. He smoothed over regional variations, erased traces of Swedish and Sami influence, and presented Finland not as a crossroads of cultures, but as a primordial unity waiting to awaken. When Väinämöinen, the old bard god, sang the world into being in the Kalevala's opening lines, he wasn't just recounting creation, he was scripting a nationalist manifesto. By the time Finnish soldiers marched against Soviet tanks in the Winter War of 1939, they did so with Kalevala verses on their lips, convinced they were defending a destiny as old as the epic's heroes. The Brothers Grimm played a similar game, but with fairy tales. Their children's and household tales weren't innocent folklore, they were linguistic archaeology, digging for the Ur-Germanic roots they believed lurked beneath every peasant story. Jacob Grimm's preface to the 1812 edition drips with political intent. These tales, he insisted, were the unbroken inheritance of the Volk, uncorrupted by French or Roman influence. Never mind that Cinderella had Chinese variants, or that half their sources were middle-class women with French educations. The Grimm's edits were surgical. Out went any hint of cosmopolitanism. In came pagan motifs and moralistic endings that mirrored their vision of a disciplined, unified Germany. Snow White's stepmother didn't just envy beauty, she embodied the divisive foreign forces threatening national purity. Yet not all myth-making served the powerful. In Ireland, where British rule had systematically dismantled Gaelic culture, rebels reached for a different kind of legend. Cú Chulainn, the Hound of Ulster, wasn't just a warrior from the Táin Bó Cúailnge, he was a mirror held up to colonial suffering. When Patrick Pearse invoked him before the Easter Rising of 1916, the parallels were deliberate. A hero standing alone against impossible odds, his body tied to a stone pillar in death, just as Ireland itself was bound to empire. But here's the twist: unlike Wagner's manufactured Siegfried, Cú Chulainn's legend thrived on his flaws. His battle frenzy, his tragic pride, even his doomed love for Emer made him human. Irish nationalists didn't need a sanitized hero, they needed one whose wounds mirrored their own. Enter Marx and Engels, watching this mythic arms race with raised eyebrows. To them, myths weren't eternal truths but ideological smokescreens, tools to mask class conflict. In the German ideology, Marx sliced through romantic nationalism's pretensions. Ancient epics weren't revelations of national spirit, but products of material conditions, shaped by the same economic forces that forged plows and swords. Yet even Marx couldn't resist myth's pull. When he described capitalism as a vampire sucking the blood of laborers, he was reaching for the oldest language humans have, the kind that turns abstraction into monsters and heroes. What unites these 19th century movements, from Wagner's operas to Gaelic revivalism, is their shared recognition of myth's plasticity. A story could be a battering ram for empire or a shield against it, depending on who held the pen. The real magic wasn't in the tales themselves, but in the alchemy of retelling the moment when a listener stops hearing a story about the past and starts seeing a blueprint for the future. And that alchemy wasn't confined to theaters or textbooks. It pulsed through strikes and uprisings, whispering that if the world could be imagined differently once, it could be so again. Lenin's favorite metaphor wasn't lifted from Marx, it was stolen from the Greeks. The state is a machine for oppression. He'd thunder, but the image that stuck was Prometheus, the fire thief reborn as the Bolshevik vanguard. Soviet propaganda didn't just borrow myths, it gutted and rewrote them with proletarian ink. Suddenly, Prometheus wasn't just a rebel against Olympus, he was the embodiment of the working class, his chains forged not by Zeus but by bourgeois capitalism. Even the gods got a class analysis. In a 1922 poster, Hercules doesn't slay a hydra. He strangles a three-headed monster labeled monarchy, capital, and religion. The message was clear: revolution wasn't just politics, It was the latest chapter in an ancient battle between oppressors and the oppressed, but the real twist. The USSR's militant atheism relied on the very mythic logic it claimed to despise. Take Sisyphus Camus' absurd hero became a Soviet everyman in propaganda films, his eternal boulder transformed into the collective struggle toward communism. The irony was delicious. A regime that banned religion couldn't resist framing its own history as an epic. Even the hammer and sickle owed a debt to older symbols. Thor's hammer reforged for the tractor factory, Demeter's sickle taken up by the collective farm. The Kremlin denounced myths as superstition, yet its artists kept reaching for archetypes older than the Kremlin itself. Bertolt Brecht saw the game before most. His The Caucasian Chalk Circle retooled an ancient Chinese fable into a Marxist parable, but his masterstroke was the life of Galileo. Here, the scientist wasn't just a truth seeker, he was a Prometheus who blinked, a warning about the cost of compromise. Brecht understood what Soviet censors missed. Myths don't need gods to work, they need stakes, sacrifices, and the illusion of inevitability. When his Galileo mutters, "Unhappy the land that needs heroes," he's skewering both fascist cults of personality and Stalin's own myth-making. Enter Gramsci watching from his prison cell. His theory of cultural hegemony explained why the USSR needed these stories so badly. If capitalism maintained power not just through force but by shaping what people considered common sense, then socialism needed its own myths to break that spell. The worker as Atlas posters weren't just art, they were counter-propaganda, replacing the Madonna with the steelworker, the crucifix with the wrench. Gramsci called this the war of position, a battle to control the stories a culture tells itself. Yet fascism was already weaponizing myths with far darker precision. Mussolini didn't just admire Roman emperors, he staged photo ops in wolf skin caps, grafting fascism onto the Romulus legend. Meanwhile, Nazi mystics twisted Norse sagas into Aryan origin stories, Siegfried's sword now dripping with racial ideology. The terrifying lesson: myths don't care who wields them. The same archetype that inspired union strikes in Detroit could justify death camps in Dachau, proof that a story's power lies not in its plot, but in who gets to write the ending. Hitler didn't just read the Norse Eddas, he gutted them. By the time Nazi ideologues finished with the sagas, the hammer-wielding Thor wasn't a complex god of storms and protection. He was a blonde Übermensch, his mythology stripped of nuance and repackaged as racial propaganda. The original tales, steeped in warnings about pride and the inevitability of Ragnarök, were twisted into something unrecognizable. Where Viking poets sang of Odin sacrificing his eye for wisdom, the Nazis saw only a blue-eyed warlord, a divine endorsement of their conquest. The Völkisch movement, so-called scholars scoured texts for evidence of Aryan purity, cherry-pinking verses while ignoring the saga's deeper themes, that even gods couldn't escape fate, that power demanded sacrifice, that hubris led to ruin. The irony, the very myths they weaponized contained the antidote to their ideology, if anyone had bothered to read them whole. Leni Riefenstahl's films were the cinematic embodiment of this distortion. In Triumph of the Will, Nuremberg's rallies didn't just resemble Wagnerian opera. They were staged as a living ring cycle, with Hitler as Siegfried reborn. Her camera angles turned stormtroopers into mythic heroes, their marches choreographed like the Einherjar marching to Valhalla. But here's the sleight of hand. The real Siegfried of the Nibelungenlied is a tragic figure, doomed by betrayal and his own naivete. Riefenstahl erased the tragedy, leaving only the aesthetic of power. The effect was hypnotic, a nation of moviegoers conditioned to see fascism not as politics, but as destiny written in runes. Even Joseph Campbell, the famed mythologist, initially fell for the allure. In his early writings, he praised fascism's mythic renewal, drawn to its pageantry like a moth to flame. Only later, witnessing the horrors of war, did he recoil, calling it the corruption of symbols. His regret was a lesson in how easily stories can be hijacked. Myths aren't inherently good or evil. They're mirrors reflecting the values of those who wield them. The Nazis didn't just borrow Norse mythology, they inverted it, replacing its fatalism with fantasies of racial immortality. But myths, like rivers, find their way back to their true course. Post-war Europe saw a quiet rebellion against this distortion. In Iceland, poets like Einar Benediktsson resuscitated the Eddas as anti-fascist texts, highlighting Odin's wanderings among the common folk. East German playwrights staged Thor adaptations where the god's hammer smashed swastikas. Meanwhile, the civil rights movement in America reclaimed older symbols. John Coltrane's A Love Supreme riffed on the idea of transcendence found in West African grit traditions, turning myth into a bridge between struggles. The most poignant reclamation came from the Sami people, whose indigenous traditions the Nazis had tried to erase. In the 1970s, Sami artists began weaving their joik songs, once banned as primitive, into protests against oil drilling. Their myths of the Northern Lights as ancestral voices became environmental manifestos. It was a defiant reminder: no one owns these stories, they outlive empires. They resist simplification, and when the next revolution comes, you can bet it'll speak in the language of giants and gods, not to glorify power, but to dismantle it. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't just cite Exodus in his speeches, he became Moses for the 20th century. On the night before his assassination, standing in the rain-slick Memphis darkness, he didn't talk about legislation or protest tactics. He spoke of mountaintops and promised lands, wrapping the civil rights movement in a story as old as human longing. The brilliance was in the adaptation. Pharaoh wasn't just a figure from scripture, he was Jim Crow, redlining the snarling police dogs of Birmingham. And the Israelites, they were sharecroppers and sanitation workers, their weary feet marching toward freedom. This wasn't mere metaphor. King understood that Exodus wasn't just a Jewish story. It was a blueprint for liberation, one that could be borrowed, reshaped, and made to speak to the struggles of Black America. When he thundered, "I've seen the promised land," he wasn't predicting victory. He was invoking a mythic inevitability, the unshakable truth that oppression must end because the story demanded it. Feminists were mining myths for the same explosive power, but with a twist, where patriarchy had turned Medusa into a monster. A warning to women who dared resist the second wave reclaimed her as a heroine. Suddenly, her serpent hair wasn't a curse, it was a crown of defiance, her stony gaze a weapon against male violence. Poet May Sarton put it bluntly: Medusa was the first woman to say no. And then there was Lilith, Adam's first wife in Jewish folklore, erased from scripture for refusing submission. Feminists resurrected her as the original rebel, her name repurposed for underground newsletters and abortion funds. The message was clear: if myths had been used to cage women, they could also be keys. Maya Angelou took this further, threading African cosmologies through her verse like golden wires. In Still I Rise, she didn't just invoke resilience, she channeled the Yoruba Orisha Oshun, goddess of rivers and sweetness, her laughter a counterspell to white supremacy's lies. Angelou's genius was in showing how diaspora could be a source of power, not just rupture. When she wrote of the dream and the hope of the slave, she wasn't echoing King's biblical cadence. She was reaching back to Anansi the trickster, Biara Rabbit, the whole stolen tapestry of stories that survived the Middle Passage. Order Lord sharpened this into theory. Her essay poetry is not a luxury, argued that the mythic wasn't escapism. It was the battleground where marginalized voices could rewrite reality. For Black queer women, she insisted, the imagination wasn't frivolous. It was the first act of resistance, the space where futures unchained by oppression could be rehearsed. Lord's biomythography, Zomi didn't just blend memoir and legend. It proved her point, casting her own life as an epic where Caribbean spirits walked Brooklyn streets. And then the myths escaped human politics entirely. When environmentalists embraced Gaia theory in the 1970s, they weren't just personifying the planet, they were reactivating the oldest story of all, Earth as a living, sacred being. Indigenous activists had known this for millennia, of course, but now scientists like James Lovelock gave it Western legitimacy. Protest signs swapped slogans for Celtic knots, tree sitters invoked dryads. The stakes were suddenly mythic again, not just pollution but the murder of a goddess. What ties these movements together is their refusal to let myths be relics. A story about a snake-haired woman or a wandering desert tribe isn't just a tale. It's a tool waiting for the hands bold enough to wield it. And when those hands belong to the oppressed, even the oldest stories can become new weapons. James Lovelock never called himself a prophet, but his Gaia hypothesis landed like a thunderclap in the 1970s, not just as science but as myth reborn. The idea that Earth functions as a single, self-regulating organism didn't just challenge academic orthodoxy, it whispered something older, something primal. Suddenly, Lovelock's graphs and atmospheric models were echoing what the ancient Greeks knew as Gaia, the Incas called Pachamama, and the Celts revered as Danu. The irony was delicious. A British chemist in a lab coat had accidentally revived the oldest deity of all, the living Earth herself. Environmentalists seized on this collision of data and divinity. When protesters painted Gaia's face on banners at anti-nuclear rallies, they weren't just decorating signs, they were weaponizing a narrative. Science had given them the numbers, but myth gave them the fire. Yet this revival came with shadows. Indigenous leaders like Winona LaDuke pointed out the uncomfortable truth. While Western activists rediscovered Earth goddesses, native communities had been speaking for rivers and forests for centuries, often to deaf ears. The Hopi prophecies of Koyaanisqatsi, life out of balance, were cited at climate marches, but too often stripped of their cultural context. The danger wasn't just appropriation. It was the noble savage trope creeping in, framing indigenous wisdom as static, mystical, and separate from the very real political fights over land rights. Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwai Smith called this the museum effect, myths treated as artifacts rather than living arguments. The challenge became clear: how to honor these stories without romanticizing them, how to let them guide without erasing the people who kept them alive. Vandana Shiva offered one answer with her concept of Earth democracy. Drawing from Hindu cosmology's sacred groves and Punjabi farmers' seed-saving traditions, she reframed environmentalism not as charity, but as cosmic justice. In her telling, Monsanto wasn't just a corporation. It was Vritra, the drought demon of the Vedas, hoarding life's waters. This wasn't metaphor. It was strategic myth-making, turning patent law into an epic battle. Shiva's genius lay in showing how ancient stories could hack modern systems. When Indian villagers hugged trees to block loggers in the Chipko movement, they weren't just protesting. They were reenacting the lore of the Bishnois, 15th century ecocides who died protecting sacred kedri trees. The past wasn't precedent, it was ammunition. Then came the digital age where myth's shape shifted once more. Memes replaced woodcuts, but the archetypes stayed startlingly familiar. The "thanks, I hate it" reaction face of a disgusted cat. That's Loki's chaotic smirk in JPEG form. Climate strikers photoshopping Greta Thunberg as a Valkyrie riding a solar panel weren't just goofing. They were participating in the oldest human instinct, dressing today's struggles in yesterday's symbols. Anonymous activists in Guy Fawkes masks channeled the gunpowder plot's failed rebellion into a global icon of dissent. The medium changed, but the magic didn't. A TikTok trend could now carry the same subversive charge as a medieval ballad about Robin Hood, both smuggling rebellion through the back door of collective imagination. The lesson echoes across time. When facts feel feudal, stories become siege engines. Whether carved on temple walls or shared in hashtags, they do more than explain the world. They give us the courage to dismantle it. And perhaps that's the real alchemy of myth, not just to comfort but to conspire. Anonymous didn't wear Guy Fawkes masks by accident. They were invoking the ultimate trickster archetype. That grinning, mustachioed face, lifted straight from V for Vendetta, became the perfect modern myth for digital dissent. It wasn't just anonymity, it was theater, a way to turn faceless hackers into a collective folk hero. Like Loki spinning illusions or Anansi weaving webs, Anonymous used humor and chaos to expose power's fragility. When they flooded extremist forums with gay porn or crashed corporate servers with denial-of-service pranks, they weren't just hacking, they were performing a ritual as old as storytelling itself, the trickster shattering the sacred. The irony, even as they mocked authority, they became a legend themselves, a decentralized, ever-shifting god of the internet age, impossible to pin down or silence. Hong Kong's protesters mastered this mythic playbook with eerie precision. Facing China's Great Firewall, they couldn't shout democracy outright, so they hid their rebellion in pop culture. Glory to Hong Kong, their protest anthem, borrowed the soaring chords of Les Miserables, but the real genius was in their memes. Mulan, Disney's warrior princess, got repurposed as a freedom fighter slashing through red banners. Harry Potter references Fight the Death Eaters, turned police into Voldemort's agents. These weren't just inside jokes, they were linguistic cloaks, slipping subversion past censors. When a government bans political speech, how do you prosecute a teenager holding a Dumbledore's Army sign? The stories became armor, proving that even in the digital panopticon, mythic symbols could carve out spaces of defiance. Then there's Pepe the Frog, a cautionary tale in mythic drift. What began as an apolitical comic character, a stoned frog sighing, "feels good man," got twisted into a symbol for everything from white nationalism to anti-fascist satire. The alt-right didn't just use Pepe, they ritualized him, turning a harmless meme into a hateful totem. His transformation reveals the dark side of mythic ambiguity. Symbols don't stay pure. Just as ancient gods could be claimed by emperors or revolutionaries depending on who held the pen, digital icons are battlegrounds. The same plasticity that let Hong Kong protesters weaponize cartoon characters also let extremists turn a frog into a hate symbol. This volatility raises uncomfortable questions. When Anonymous cribbed Guy Fawkes, were they romanticizing a terrorist? When eco-activists dress as dryads, are they trivializing indigenous cosmologies? The line between homage and appropriation blurs fast in the meme wars. Even well-intentioned myth-making can backfire. Look at how fake news co-opted the language of conspiracy theories, or how corporations now slap resistance branding on sneakers. The danger isn't just hijacking, it's dilution, turning potent stories into empty aesthetics. Yet the hunger for these symbols persists because they work. A meme can cross borders faster than a manifesto, carrying rebellion in its pixels. The challenge now is wielding them ethically, recognizing that myths, whether carved in stone or shared as GIF, aren't just tools. They're living things, and once unleashed, their meaning is never fully yours to control. Rewriting myths isn't just an act of creativity, it's an act of power. Take the Dalit reinterpretations of the Ramayana, where Ravana, the demon king, transforms from villain to anti-caste hero. In these retellings, his defiance of Rama isn't evil, it's resistance against a divinely sanctioned hierarchy. But contrast this with Hindutva's rigid, politicized Ramayana, where Rama's bow becomes a symbol of Hindu supremacy, and the epic's nuance is flattened into propaganda. The same story, twisted in opposite directions, one to uplift the oppressed, the other to justify dominance. This tension lies at the heart of mythic manipulation. Who gets to control the narrative and for what ends? Disney's global empire offers a softer but no less potent example. Their Hercules scrubs the Greek hero's darker edges, his murderous rage, his tragic end, leaving a grinning, marketable demigod. The problem isn't just simplification, it's the way these sanitized versions colonize imaginations. When a child in Lagos or Jakarta pictures Hercules, they see a disnified hero, not the complex figure who haunted Euripides' tragedies. Chinua Achebe warned of the danger of a single story, and here it is. Myth stripped of cultural specificity, repackaged as universal, which really means Western archetypes. The cost, a loss of the raw, uncomfortable truths these tales once carried. Yet feminist retellings like Madeline Miller's Circe or Pat Barker's The Silence of the Girls argue for myth's mutability. By centering sidelined women, the witch, the war captive, they expose the patriarchal biases baked into classical canon. Is this erasure or excavation? The answer depends on who you ask. Traditionalists decry revisionism, but as scholar Ananya Kabir points out, myths have always been contested terrain. The Mahabharata exists in hundreds of regional variants, each reflecting the values of its tellers. The real question isn't whether we should rewrite myths, but who historically held the pen and who's seizing it now. Decoding modern mythic messages means reading between the lines of everything from political ads to superhero films. When a campaign invokes the American frontier, it's tapping into pioneer myths of manifest destiny. When Black Panther reimagines African futures, it's wresting sci-fi from Eurocentric tropes. The tools are the same as in ancient Athens or Vedic India: symbolism, archetypes, the weight of tradition. The difference: today's myths spread at the speed of a click, their impact amplified by algorithms and echo chambers. The ethical tightrope is clear: myths must breathe and evolve, but not at the expense of their roots. The Dalit Ramayana enriches the epic by revealing silenced voices. Hindutva's version impoverishes it by enforcing dogma. Disney's myths entertain but often erase. Feminist retellings recover but risk overcorrection. Perhaps the solution lies in Achebe's call for a balance of stories, not one narrative to rule them all, but a chorus of voices, each honoring the past while daring to imagine anew. After all, the oldest lesson myths teach is this: every story is a battleground, and the fight for its meaning never ends. Spotting political subtext in myths starts with recognizing the patterns hidden in plain sight. Take flood narratives, they're not just about water. From the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh to Noah's Ark, these stories of deluges and rebirths often mask critiques of corruption. The flood isn't just disaster, it's a reset button, washing away a decadent regime to make room for something new. When environmental activists today invoke rising tides, they're tapping into that same symbolic reservoir, framing climate collapse as both warning and opportunity. Then there's the trickster, Loki, Anansi, Coyote, the ultimate saboteur of order. These figures don't just cause chaos, they expose hypocrisy. In West African folklore, Anansi outwits powerful animals not just for fun, but to show that authority is often a paper tiger. Modern parallels: think of satire shows or viral memes mocking politicians. The Hunger Games' Katniss Everdeen, with her forced participation in a deadly game, is a direct descendant of Theseus in the Minotaur's Labyrinth, both stories of sacrificial victims turning the system's violence back on itself. Suzanne Collins didn't just borrow the myth, she weaponized it for a generation facing economic dystopia. To decode myths critically, compare versions. The Greek Medea is a murderous witch in Euripides' play, but in older Colchian tales, she's a priestess defending her homeland from Greek invaders. The difference isn't just perspective, it's propaganda. Euripides wrote for an Athenian audience eager to justify colonialism. The Colchian version reveals the silenced counter-narrative. Similarly, Disney's Hercules erases the hero's brutal flaws, turning him into a corporate-friendly underdog. The lesson: always ask who benefits from this telling. For deeper analysis, Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces is a starting point, but don't stop there. Rita Mee Brown's Starting from Scratch dissects how myths reinforce gender norms, while Chinua Achbe's Things Fall Apart dismantles colonial storytelling. Pair these with modern case studies, like protesters in Thailand adapting Harry Potter spells as rally chants, Expelliarmus, against police batons, or Ukrainian artists recasting Zelensky as a cyberpunk David against Russia's Goliath. Myths aren't relics, they're live wires, and the right story can electrify a movement. The key is to read like a rebel. When you encounter a myth, scan for the seams, the places where the telling feels too neat, too moral, too convenient. That's where the hidden payload lies, because every culture's dominant myths are like palimpsests, scraped clean and rewritten by winners. Your job, to hold them up to the light and see the old ink bleeding through. When Russian tanks rolled toward Kiev in 2022, Ukraine didn't just fight back with bullets, it fought back with stories. At the heart of their resistance stood an unlikely figure, Cossack Mame, a folkloric warrior often depicted sitting cross-legged with a bandura, a rifle slung across his back. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was strategic myth-making. Mame represented the archetype of the free, untamable steppe fighter, a direct rebuke to Putin's narrative of Ukrainians as little Russians in need of paternalistic rule. Overnight, murals of Mame appeared on bomb shelters, his image stamped on guerrilla posters, his defiant posture mirrored in President Zelensky's own transformation from comedian to wartime leader. The message was clear: Ukraine wasn't just defending territory, it was resurrecting an identity Russia had tried to erase for centuries. Zelensky's theatrical instincts turned out to be his greatest weapon. Trained in improv comedy, he understood something autocrats often forget: that power isn't just about force, it's about who controls the story. His early video addresses from the streets of Kiev, filmed on a shaky smartphone, didn't sound like presidential decrees. They felt like hero monologues from an epic, deliberately invoking the cadence of folk tales. "I need ammunition, not a ride" wasn't just a soundbite, it was a modern-day variation on the Cossack aphorism, "Better to die standing than live kneeling." Even his olive-green t-shirts became a visual shorthand, stripping away the pomp of statecraft to align himself with Mame's rugged simplicity. Putin, meanwhile, twisted mythology in the opposite direction. His speeches leaned heavily on the myth of Kievan Rus, the medieval Slavic federation centered in Kiev, framing Russia as its sole legitimate heir. Never mind that modern Ukraine sits on Rus's heartland, or that Moscow was a backwater when Kiev's golden-domed churches were already standing. The myth served his purpose. If Rus was Russia's spiritual ancestor, then Ukraine's independence wasn't just illegitimate, it was sacrilege. This wasn't history, it was political alchemy, turning soft power nostalgia into a casus belli. But Ukraine countered with something even older: the vyshyvanka, the traditional embroidered shirt. Every stitch in these garments carries meaning. Geometric patterns once acted as talismans against evil, and during the invasion, they became stealth uniforms of defiance. Civilians wore them under bulletproof vests. Soldiers tucked embroidered patches into their gear. Folk songs, too, became weapons. The anthem, Oi U Luzi Chervona Kalina, a 19th century tune about resilience, surged back into popularity. Its lyrics, Oh, the red viburnum in the meadow, now symbolizing blood and rebirth. Even children's cartoons got in on the act. The beloved Mavka, a forest spirit from Slavic folklore, was reimagined as a protector of Ukrainian land, her flowing hair tangled with barbed wire. Taiwan watches this mythic playbook closely as China ramps up threats, invoking the One China myth that frames Taiwan as a wayward province. Taiwanese artists and activists are digging into their own storied past. The legend of Queen Mother of the West, a Taoist deity who grants immortality, gets repurposed in protests as a symbol of Taiwan's enduring spirit. Traditional glove puppetry, once entertainment, now stages satirical shows where heroes outwit dragon-like invaders. And just as Ukraine's trident emblem harks back to Viking Age princely seals, Taiwan's activists highlight its Austronesian indigenous roots, proof that its history stretches far beyond China's claims. The through line is undeniable. When empires weaponize myths to justify domination, the oppressed reach for older, deeper stories, not just to resist, but to remind the world and themselves that their existence was never contingent on an oppressor's permission. Ukraine's Mame, Taiwan's Queen Mother, even the Some's sun motifs, these aren't decorations. They're declarations that some truths outlive empires and some stories refuse to die. Taiwan's coastlines have whispered Mazu's name for centuries, but today her pilgrimages carry more than incense. They hum with political electricity. The sea goddess, worshipped by fishermen and presidents alike, has become an unlikely shield against Beijing's encroachment. Every spring, her golden statue travels hundreds of miles in a palanquin, flanked by devotees in neon vests. To outsiders, it looks like piety. Look closer. The routes now detour past sensitive military sites, turning religious processions into silent displays of sovereignty. Crowds chant not just prayers, but coded resistance. Mazu protects Taiwan sounds spiritual, but the subtext is geopolitical. Even the goddess's iconography rebels. Traditional statues show her seated calmly, but newer ones depict her standing, even striding, as if marching toward defense. This isn't just faith, it's mythic judo, using China's own claim of shared cultural heritage to assert difference. After all, if Mazu's home temple is in Fujian, why does she seem so determined to stay in Taiwan? Meanwhile, a competing symbolic language thrives in the island's art and protests the Formosan mythos, a deliberate counter to China's dragon imagery. While Beijing's propaganda leans on imperial dragons, Taiwanese artists resurrect the Formosan black bear, an endemic species nearly hunted to extinction. Its resurgence mirrors Taiwan's own story, a creature declared gone, now padding back into the forest. Street murals recast the bear as a guardian, its paws cradling not cubs but satellite dishes and semiconductors. The message is sly but potent. Taiwan's identity isn't borrowed from ancient dynasties. It's rooted in this land's unique ecology. Even the humble sweet potato, a crop that sustained generations through famine, gets mythic treatment, its heart-shaped leaves plastered on protest signs as a rebuke to China's dragon fruit ambitions. Language activists take this further, diving into Austronesian legends that predate Chinese influence by millennia. The Peiwen people's creation myth, where the sun descends in a clay pot to birth humanity, isn't just folklore, it's forensic evidence of Taiwan's primordial independence. When indigenous linguists revive near-extinct words for tide or mountain, they're not just preserving vocabulary, they're reactivating a world view where Taiwan isn't China's appendage, but the ancestral homeland of cultures stretching from Madagascar to Easter Island. Myths are cultural airbags, says Ame's activist Pane Kumod. When political collisions happen, they're what keep our consciousness intact. Yet myths can also fog the truth. Pro-Beijing disinformation campaigns flood Taiwanese social media with warped folklore claims that Mazu weeps for reunification, or that the black bear is actually a Chinese panda in disguise. These narratives weaponize the same symbols that unite Taiwanese, twisting them into fifth columns. The battle isn't just over territory, it's over whose stories get to define reality. And in that fight, Taiwan has an unlikely ally, its own mythology, proving that sometimes the most powerful resistance isn't shouted in slogans, but murmured in the language of gods and bears and sweet potatoes. QAnon didn't just spread conspiracy theories, it built a modern mythology, complete with prophets, epic battles, and apocalyptic stakes. At its core, the movement functioned like a digital mystery cult, with Q as its cryptic oracle, dropping breadcrumbs in the form of coded posts that followers deciphered like ancient priests interpreting omens. The parallels to mythic structures are unnervingly precise. The storm they prophesied borrowed its imagery straight from Ragnarök, the Norse end times where gods and monsters clash in final battle. But here's the twist where ancient myths often carried warnings about hubris or chaos. QAnon's narrative offered something far more seductive, the promise that its adherents weren't just bystanders, but chosen warriors in a cosmic war between good and evil. This wasn't just storytelling, it was identity engineering, turning ordinary people into actors in a grand, preordained drama where every tweet could feel like a sacred text. Now enter deepfakes, the 21st century's answer to divine apparitions. Imagine a video of Zeus materializing over New York, commanding believers to rise up, or a resurrected JFK announcing a new political dawn. These aren't hypotheticals. In India, manipulated clips of Bollywood stars endorsing politicians have already swayed elections, while in Ghana, a viral deepfake of a chief's ghost warning against mining protests tapped into ancestral reverence. The danger isn't just technological, it's psychological. Humans are hardwired to trust faces and voices, a vulnerability that turns synthetic deities and leaders into potent weapons. Joan Donovan's research on meme warfare reveals how these tactics exploit our oldest instincts. We're primed to believe stories that fit familiar archetypes, whether they're delivered on parchment or a pixelated screen. Yet, even as algorithms spin new myths, indigenous communities are fighting a quieter battle against cultural counterfeits. The rise of plastic shamans, non-native charlatans selling fake sweat lodge ceremonies or misappropriated vision quests isn't just appropriation, it's mythic identity theft. When a self-proclaimed guru repackages Cherokee stories as self-help platitudes or Inuit cosmology as corporate team-building exercises, they're not just distorting traditions, they're severing living stories from their roots. The Navajo Nation's push to trademark sacred symbols like the Yabichai isn't about ownership, it's about preventing spiritual Walmartification, where myths become hollow commodities stripped of context and consequence. So how do we reclaim myths from disinformation's grip? Educators are turning to critical myth literacy, teaching students to dissect stories the way a biologist examines cells. In Finland, schools contrast the Kalevala's nationalist interpretations with its Sami influences, exposing how myths get weaponized. Australian librarians host story autopsy workshops where teens compare Dreamtime narratives with QAnon posts, spotting shared structures, the chosen heroes, the imminent threats, the us versus them binaries. The goal isn't to debunk myths, but to defang their toxicity, showing how ancient storytelling tools can build bridges or burn them. Because the antidote to manipulative myths isn't fewer stories, it's better ones, told with the depth and respect they deserve. Teaching myths in today's polarized classrooms isn't just about reciting ancient tales, it's about turning them into mirrors for critical thinking. Start by framing myths not as dusty artifacts, but as living debates. Take the Odyssey. Is Odysseus a cunning hero or a violent colonizer? Pose that question to students, and suddenly, Homer's epic becomes a workshop on perspective. Assign rewrites where Penelope narrates her years of waiting, or the Cyclops tells his side of the blinding. The goal isn't to replace one correct version with another, but to reveal how myths stretch and shift with each retelling. But beware the trap of binaries. When we reduce myths to hero vs villain, we risk mirroring the oversimplifications flooding social media. Medusa's story, for instance, gets flattened into a feminist icon or a monstrous cautionary tale. But what about the Greek context that painted her as a tragic figure cursed by Athena? Encourage students to sit with the discomfort of ambiguity. A myth's power often lies in its contradictions, not its morals. Resources matter. The Living Myths podcast models this beautifully, unpacking how the same story, say, Icarus flying too close to the sun, can be a warning about hubris to one culture and a celebration of daring to another. Pair these with primary sources. Compare Ovid's Metamorphoses to contemporary indigenous flood myths, noting who gets to speak and who stays silent. Now, pivot to our fractured present. As climate disasters and wars escalate, myths are emerging as survival tools. Ukrainian refugees recount folk tales of the fox outsmarting the wolf, finding solace in narratives of resilience. Pacific Islanders reframe rising seas not just as crisis, but as the return of the creator Tangaroa. These aren't escapes from reality, they're frameworks for processing it. The classroom's job to equip students not just with the tools to decode these stories, but to rewrite them for the battles ahead. The oceans aren't just rising, they're rewriting our oldest stories. When the Marshall Islands speak of Lichtner, the giant eel whose thrashing once caused floods, they're no longer recounting legend, they're forecasting. Scientists predict these islands could be uninhabitable by 2050, and suddenly, that myth isn't metaphor, it's manual. This is how climate collapse births new origin tales, not as replacements for the old ones, but as layers like sediment pressed over ancient bedrock. Take the New Atlantis narratives sprouting in Miami and Jakarta, where developers and activists clash over what rising seas mean. To corporations, it's an engineering challenge. To street artists painting submerged skylines on seawalls, it's the return of the flood myth, this time with carbon credits and concrete. Cli-fi isn't just a genre, it's myth-making in real time. Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future reads less like fiction and more like a sacred text for the Anthropocene, complete with eco-terrorist avengers and central bankers as unlikely prophets. His opening scene, a deadly heatwave in India, has already found its echo in Pakistan's record-breaking 53°C summers. What makes Cli-fi mythic isn't its predictions, but its framing. These stories position humanity not as victims or villains, but as characters in a drama grand enough to warrant gods. When Robinson writes of carbon coins and rewilding the Sahara, he's not proposing policy, he's offering parables. The most radical twist, his ministry isn't a government agency, it's a priesthood for a new cosmology where survival is the highest sacrament. Meanwhile, indigenous futurists are stitching space-age threads into traditional tapestries. The The Maori sci-fi anthology speculative Aotearoa reimagines ancestral navigation stars as warp drives, while Inuit artists like Kuzin van Huvelen build sculptures of nanorobots shaped like seal hunting tools. This isn't just blending old and new, it's asserting that indigenous knowledge was always futuristic. The Cherokee Nation's Mars mission program trains youth in both rocket science and stomp dances, because why shouldn't the first Martian language include words for spirit and supernova? As Anishinaabe scholar Grace Dillon puts it, indigenous futurism isn't about escaping Earth, it's about remembering how to live here. Then there's AI, slithering into our mythic subconscious like a digital Prometheus. Silicon Valley's obsession with the singularity drips with religious fervor, call it rapture for nerds. But the real myth-making happens in the margins, where programmers joke about GPT as a trickster deity or artists train neural networks on Yoruba creation myths to generate new ones. The irony, these new gods are built on datasets scraped from humanity's oldest stories, making I less an inventor and more a shaman, channeling ancestral voices through silicon. What unites these threads is their refusal to let crisis sterilize imagination. When the Kogi people of Colombia send elder brothers to warn industrial societies of ecological collapse, they're not offering data, they're offering story, wrapped in the language of their mountain deities. That's the alchemy we need now, myths that don't just predict the future but shape it, because when the waters rise, the last levee won't be concrete, it'll be narrative, the stories we tell to keep drowning at bay. Carl Jung called it the collective unconscious, that hidden reservoir of symbols and stories we all share, wired into humanity like an ancient operating system. When protesters in Hong Kong dress as Harry Potter characters or Ukrainian artists paint Cossack warriors on barricades, they're tapping into something deeper than strategy. Jung believed archetypes, the hero, the trickster, the shadow, live in our neural wiring waiting to be summoned. A myth isn't just a story, it's a psychological trigger, activating emotions too primal to articulate. Brain scans back this up. Studies at Princeton show narratives about underdogs overcoming oppression light up the same regions as physical pain and relief. Data might inform, but myths feel, and that's why they outlast empires. Mitchell Foucault would smirk at Jung's mysticism. To him, myths weren't universal truths but battlegrounds where power shapes reality. Consider how colonizers rewrote indigenous creation stories as primitive fables, or how Victorian moralists sanitized Greek myths into children's tales. Foucault's insight was brutal. Whoever controls the myths controls what's thinkable. When British rulers banned Gaelic legends in Ireland, they weren't just erasing culture. They were deleting Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Yet here's the paradox Foucault missed. Myths are slippery. They mutate in the mouths of the oppressed. The same Biara rabbit-tail slaveholders dismissed as simpleton humor became manuals for survival, teaching subtlety in the face of brute force. Jonathan Haidt's research on moral psychology reveals why this alchemy works. His righteous mind theory shows humans don't reason first and believe second. We feel, then rationalize. Myths bypass debate entirely, speaking directly to our moral intuitions. A statistic about income inequality might glaze eyes, but Robin Hood stealing from the rich. That sticks. This explains why activists from Gandhi to Extinction Rebellion wrap hard truths in mythic frames. It's cognitive caffeine for empathy. But beware the seduction of symbolism. Over-relying on myths risks trading substance for spectacle. The Arab Spring's initial euphoria, framed as a heroic awakening, collapsed when faced with gritty governance. Romanticizing resistance can blind us to the grind of reform. Even Jung warned of archetypes becoming prisons. When a movement's identity calcifies into playing the eternal victim or chosen hero, it stops adapting. The best rebels know when to wield myths and when to outgrow them, because the real magic isn't in the story itself, but in knowing you can rewrite it. Myths can forge unity, but they can also build walls. Take the idea of American exceptionalism, a narrative so potent it shaped foreign policy for generations. On the surface, it's a story of pioneering spirit and democratic ideals. But dig deeper and you'll find a darker engine, the myth of manifest destiny repackaged for the modern age, justifying everything from military intervention to economic domination. The same archetypes that once inspired revolution, the city on a hill, the chosen people, can calcify into dogma, dividing the world into heroes and villains with no room for nuance. This isn't just patriotism. It's tribalism dressed in stars and stripes. Extremist movements weaponize this same mythic logic. Jihadist propaganda doesn't just quote scripture, it frames conflict as a cosmic battle between light and darkness, with recruits cast as modern-day Salahuddins. The brilliance and danger lies in how these narratives shortcut critical thought. When a young fighter is told they're part of an ancient prophecy, the struggle stops being political and becomes sacred. The line between inspiration and indoctrination blurs. Heaven's Gate's tragic end reveals the endpoint of this logic, a cult that saw its suicide not as death, but as ascent to a UFO trailing the Hale-Bopp comet. Their leader, Marshall Applewhite, didn't invent a new religion. He pieced together sci-fi tropes and apocalyptic Christian imagery into a story so compelling, it overrode survival instincts. Nietzsche saw this coming. In The Birth of Tragedy, he warned that myths could become crutches for the weak-minded, substituting comforting fictions for hard truths. His solution, the free spirit who embraces ambiguity, who questions even the stories they love. Carl Sagan echoed this in The Demon-Haunted World, urging readers to arm themselves with baloney detection kits, skepticism, Occam's razor, peer review to resist mythic manipulation. The irony, both men understood myth's power precisely because they'd felt their pull. Nietzsche's Zarathustra is a mythic figure himself, and Sagan's cosmos is steeped in the language of epic journeys. The answer isn't rejecting myths, but holding them lightly. Consider how Iceland handles its sagas, teaching them as literature, not doctrine. Students analyze the Enjol saga not as moral instruction, but as a complex web of human choices where heroes falter and villains occasionally win sympathy. This approach preserves the story's power while inoculating against absolutism. Similarly, indigenous scholars like Vine Deloria Jr. stress that traditional myths were never meant to be static, their conversations evolving with each telling. The balance lies in what psychologist Jonathan Haidt calls the rider and the elephant. Reason might steer, but emotion, the realm of myth, provides the momentum. Effective movements harness both: the civil rights marchers who sang spirituals and filed lawsuits, the climate activists who invoke Gaia and cite IPCC reports. Myths won't disappear, nor should they, but like fire, their power depends on who wields them and whether we remember their tools, not truths. Balancing myth and reason isn't about choosing one over the other. It's about learning to dance between them. Enter critical mythicism, a way of engaging with stories that honors their emotional resonance while dissecting the power structures they uphold. Think of it like X-ray vision for narratives, appreciating the beauty of a myth's surface while scanning for the hidden machinery beneath. Neil Gaiman's American Gods nails this balance. His novel doesn't just resurrect ancient deities in modern America. It forces them to confront their own obsolescence, their complicity in shaping and sometimes warping human desires. Shadow Moon, the protagonist, doesn't blindly worship these gods. He questions them, negotiates with them, and ultimately outsmarts them. That's the critical mythicist stance: respect without reverence, curiosity without credulity. But how do we apply this to real-world struggles? Start by pairing myths with their shadow histories. Take the Founding Fathers' mythos in the United States, often framed as a flawless pantheon of democratic ideals. A critical mythicist wouldn't dismiss the story entirely, but they'd place it beside the counter-narratives, the enslaved people who built Washington, D.C., the indigenous nations displaced by a manifest destiny. This isn't debunking, it's contextualizing, revealing how myths can crystallize half-truths into cultural dogma. Activist movements already do this instinctively. When water protectors at Standing Rock invoked the Sioux prophecy of the Black Snake, a pipeline threatening sacred land, they weren't rejecting science, they were augmenting it, using myth to articulate what spreadsheets couldn't: the spiritual cost of extraction. Rebecca Solnit's Hope in the Dark offers a compass for this terrain. She argues that uncertainty, the absence of tidy endings, isn't a flaw but a feature of meaningful change. Myths often promise resolution. The hero slays the dragon, the kingdom is restored. Solnit's work reminds us that real progress is messier, more iterative. Her writing embodies critical mythicism in action, acknowledging the allure of grand narratives while resisting their false closures. The Zapatista uprising in Chiapas, Mexico, exemplifies this. They didn't frame their struggle as a clash between good and evil, but as a long conversation walking while asking, as they put it, where victory wasn't a final battle, but the ongoing act of questioning itself. The danger lies in tipping too far either way. Pure mythicism risks dogma. Pure rationalism can sterilize the imagination. Consider how climate communication flounders when it leans solely on data. Graphs of rising CO2 levels might inform, but they rarely move people. Now contrast that with the viral image of a starving polar bear, a modern-day omen, stripped of mythic language but pulsing with archetypal dread. The most effective storytelling today, from Greta Thunberg's House on Fire rhetoric to the Maori legal concept of the Wanganui River as a living ancestor, marries empirical urgency with mythic resonance. This dance between story and scrutiny isn't new. The ancient Greeks had a term for it: mythos and logos, the interplay of narrative truth and reasoned argument. What's radical now is applying that duality to the myths we're still weaving, whether they're national origin stories, Silicon Valley's disruption gospel, or the algorithmic deities shaping our digital lives. The goal isn't to strip myths of their power, but to wield that power with eyes wide open, like a surgeon who respects the scalpel's edge. After all, the best stories don't just tell us who we are, they challenge us to imagine who we might become. From the fire-stealing defiance of Prometheus to the pixelated smirk of Pepe the Frog, myths have always been more than stories. They're blueprints, smuggled across centuries and screens, waiting for the right moment to ignite. Every revolution, whether fought with muskets or memes, leans on these ancient scaffolds, dressing new struggles in old archetypes. But here's the twist: myths don't control us, we control them. The same tale that inspired French peasants to storm the Bastille can be twisted to justify tyranny. The meme that mocks power today might be co-opted by extremists tomorrow. The difference lies in who holds the pen, or the protest sign, or the social media account, and whether they wield these stories with awareness or blind zeal. Adrienne Rich once wrote, "The story's not over, it's not even past." She understood that myths aren't relics, they're alive, pulsing in our protests, our art, even our algorithms. When Ukrainian activists paint Cossack warriors on barricades or climate strikers invoke Gaia, they're not just borrowing symbols, they're entering a conversation as old as humanity itself. And you're part of it too. Every time you share a meme, retell a family legend, or question a national myth, you're either reinforcing the old maps or drawing new ones. So here's the challenge. Don't just consume myths, interrogate them. Ask whose agenda they serve, whose voices they amplify, and whose truths they erase. Then rewrite them. The comment section below isn't just a space for reactions, it's a workshop. Tell us, what's your mythic map, the story you cling to in chaos, the archetype that fuels your resistance? Hit subscribe and let's keep decoding the hidden histories that shape our world, because the next chapter isn't just waiting to be read, it's waiting to be written.